to our third session of our study of human sexuality, in particular homosexuality and the Bible. And Martha now is going to introduce our beloved speaker.
Dr. Renato Lings, and he's told me, come on up here, he's told me he's working on another book, which I think maybe this study we're coming upon with Ruth and Naomi may be a part of it. He's moving from these texts that people have used to infer things about sexual relationships into the positive examples of true relationship that we find in the Bible. And so this study is going to be on Ruth and Naomi. So we welcome you, and I want to say for any who would like to have the handouts from these 3 seminars, you can email me or get a hold of me on Facebook, Martha Rogers, and I'll be glad to email you the handouts that have been given to the group here. Renato.
Thank you.
Right. I have said earlier today in the other 2 sessions that we are going to look at 2 texts that are irrelevant for the debate, for the situation currently surrounding same-sex relationships, including same-sex marriage. So if those 2 texts are irrelevant or relevant from any other context which we have seen, let us now move in a different direction and look at a text that is relevant for our current discussions. It may have some surprising aspects to it, but as I believe you will also discover, there are things in that story that are powerful and that speak even to a modern context. I should also mention that that story made it into the final chapter of my book, along with a few other stories that are pointing in a very different direction. And it's that different direction I want to emphasize now, where we ought to be looking rather than where we ought not to be looking, because we've been taught to I would almost say to numbness, to look in the wrong places for inspiration in these texts. So let us now go to the other side of the Bible, which has it. They are there, these texts, and they speak their language to their context, and maybe we can learn something from that.
And I should say, you have a printout of the entire book of Ruth, and then you have an excerpt from his book and his commentary on the book of Ruth. So that's where we're working from now. We do not have slides for this third presentation.
So this is going to be a slightly different format from the other 2. I have not prepared a whole set of slides for it. I would invite you all to make it a little more interactive with me as a change of pace in the format too. So I'm simply starting off with this image before we go to the text, because it is a telling image, and I feel that the artist has captured some of this one essential aspect of this particular story. You may remember, those of you who have read the story recently, that the book of Ruth has 4 chapters, and in chapter 1 we have Naomi, here pictured on the right. She moves to a land called Moab, a neighboring land from her hometown of Bethlehem, and there they have 2 sons. In fact, they go there because of a famine at home, so they're trying to survive by fleeing to another country. Who hasn't heard about such things in recent times? And there, an epidemic of some sort probably sweeps the country, and her husband and 2 sons die, and she's left alone with the 2 daughters-in-law. Now, to be a widow in ancient times was not, I was almost going to say it was no fun, but what I'm really trying to say, it was not easy. Because Social Security, I know it's a debate, matter of huge debate in this country, but we have it in Scandinavia, that was not even considered an option. So if you had no children to look after you, when you got old, frail, tough, you were basically reduced to being a beggar. So here you have Naomi then, having lost her husband and son. She's standing on the right here, because she's a bit older than the other two women. And she's taking leave of her two daughters-in-law, saying, I'm going home to Bethlehem now. There's nothing more for me to do in this country. I've lost everything. So why don't you go back to your families and your people? You're still young, you too. You can get married, again, remarried. And that will be fine for you. I'm going home. And then one of the two young women, you can see her in the background, Orpah. Somebody told me the other day that Oprah Winfrey took her name from her, but got the letters in the wrong order.
That's true.
It's true.
Orpah to became Oprah, right? But that's an aside. So Orpah is returning to Moab hesitantly, but she's been told so by the older woman. And you know, in ancient times, cultures were hierarchical. The older person was the wiser, and you obeyed them. That was the norm. So Orpah says sure, but then something unusual happens, and this is what we're seeing in this picture. The norm is being broken. Ruth the younger says to the older woman, no way, Jose. She rebels. She said, I am going with you. And this then becomes the beginning of an amazing story that stands out in the Hebrew scriptures. Several commentators have called this book a literary gem. It's one of the most overlooked literary gems in the entire Bible. Extremely well written, starts in tragedy, in sorrow, in grief, and ends with celebration and jubilation. You can see Ruth, the younger woman's gesture here. She's just been told to return to her town in Moab. But she puts her hand over her nose and no. Where you go, I will go. Probably some of you have remembered this. Where you live, I will live. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. And where you die, I will die and be buried next to you. This is perhaps the strongest declaration of love and commitment from one person to another that we find in the entire scriptures. And curiously, Ruth's word spoken to Naomi in this situation have been used, and probably you can fill me in afterwards, in a number of churches for wedding rituals between men and women. It's extraordinary when you think of it. Well, I'm not surprised that they picked these words because it's a very strong declaration of commitment, isn't it? So I'm not surprised about that bit, but few people in the ceremony probably realized that these words were first spoken by one woman to another. So, as Martha was suggesting, we will now move to the text itself and look at some of the words and some of the phrases being used in it. I'm going to switch to another picture.
Left side.
Yes.
Okay, so here I am highlighting, the first bit I'm highlighting is chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. These words are just recited, where you go, I will go. etc. Now, before this, there's an important word that most translators miss or ignore. Okay? You find this in chapter 1, verse 14. If you look that up in your text, I wonder what it says in your English, 1:14. What does Ruth do in verse 14?
And stuck with her.
She stuck with her. The situation we saw where she does not obey, she's stuck with Naomi. Now, this is an important word in the text, among many others. Because this stuck with her, in Hebrew that would be dalak, and in the feminine as it of kaveh, that means she remained with her, or even stronger, she attached herself to Naomi. And if we go back to Genesis 2:24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, stick to his wife, cling to his wife, attach himself to his wife. It's exactly the same word. Lifelong commitment is being implied. So when you have that in Genesis, when a man leaves his father and mother and attaches himself to his wife, they form a new lifelong commitment. And Ruth is attaching herself to Naomi in a lifelong commitment. That's implied by the word choice of a marriage. So there's something permanent suggested here. Ruth indeed leaves her father and her mother and attaches herself to Naomi instead. Now, if you go to 2:11, it is interesting to see how the people of Bethlehem respond to these two women. They go back there and they recognize Naomi and they accept Ruth, who comes from a hostile nation. There was a long-standing conflict between Israel, or Judea, I should say, Judah, perhaps, and Moab. So here comes Ruth, who represents that nation, and yet she is well received. And we find this, among others, in the words of Boaz. Boaz is a wealthy landowner, where Ruth goes to collect the eaves of corn that fall from the harvester's work. This is what beggars do. These two women need to survive in something. So Ruth goes out there. And Boaz discovers her and speaks to her. And look at what he says. Boaz has been told, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. He praises her for what she has done. And even with this resonance from Genesis, leaving father and mother, is also implied. And again, I'm pointing out here how the word cling to or cleave to or attach oneself to, that's quite a strong word in the Hebrew. There are several other examples here you can read in my book.
Is that no, Yana?
Yada comes...
That you did not know before?
Ah, it's the same word. Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you.
What verse is that?
Pardon?
What verse?
Where Boaz speaks to
But
Ruth?
the God, where was that?
Yes,
It's right at the end of 2:11.
that's right.
2:11.
Where?
To let people that you did not know before. It's in 2:11.
Okay.
So, let us see what comes next. So what we're actually seeing in this particular scene where Ruth attaches herself to Naomi, that her commitment to Naomi has the strength of a marital bond. The narrator compares the two situations and puts them on an equal footing. Here I look at a number of English translations, and I found 3 of 12, a minority, but at least they are there. There are a few righteous ones. 3 that have discovered that the word is the same in the Genesis passage and here in Ruth, and use the same word. The 9 others, there's 12 of them in all, the 9 others use different words and don't see the connection. Either haven't seen it or are ignoring it. The Jewish Bible uses clings to, a man shall cling to his wife, and Ruth clung to Naomi. The NRSV, at least is doing a decent job here, saying clings to his wife and Ruth clung to her. And the New World Translation, he must stick to his wife and Ruth stuck to Naomi. So there's 3 versions at least. The other ones use different words in each case. So, if we look at this now, there are several parts in the story, the biblical story, where you can see that this relationship is actually permanent and strong. It is mutual and for life. This is emphasized in 2:20 and in 3:2. It's very interesting to see how Naomi speaks. Naomi, the older woman, is speaking about Boaz, this wealthy landowner. And she calls him, as she's speaking to Ruth, she calls him a relative of ours, which is interesting. But Naomi may be a distant relative of Boaz, but Ruth, in biological fact, isn't. But yet she says a relative of ours. And says one of our nearest kin. So Naomi is also, it's not just Ruth who feels this bond towards Naomi. Naomi accepts it and acts and speaks, indicating they are together in this. Now, an interesting situation arises here because Naomi, being the older woman and knowing Bethlehem well, she says one day to Ruth, you know what? We 2 widows here, we don't have much of a future. And anyone who has read the First Testament knows that widows, they had a hard time. So she then says to Ruth, we need a life insurance. Right? We have to do something. You're the one, you're still young and pretty. We can marry you off. Then we get a man into the family, and you know, things might work out. And you know, and they figure out a plan, and the plan works, which is good news, right? So the plan works, and Boaz realized that, oh yes, Ruth is marriageable, she's a nice woman, and so on, so why not? So he feels it's quite a good idea actually to marry this young woman. And as that materializes, that means then the women now have the life insurance. Because Ruth and Naomi are still in a permanent bond together, and Ruth is married to Boaz. That means now they are safe, on much safer ground. And then something really interesting happens. After Ruth marries Boaz, you know, they have a ceremony and the neighbors celebrate, and the narrator compares Ruth to important women in the Hebrew scriptures. One of them being Tamar, who appears in Genesis 38. She was a Canaanite woman, but thanks to her creativity, Judah, who had lost several sons, now has 2 more sons because of Tamar's intelligence. And those sons then carry on the line of Judah, which eventually becomes the most important one in the entire Israel. So you have this outsider woman doing a fantastic job there in Genesis 38. And Ruth is being compared to Tamar, which is also interesting. She's all come from an Indian nation, and yet she is important for what happens in the Bible overall. Now there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, but it's important. Boaz, when he speaks to Ruth of meeting her, there's a strong resonance between what he's saying to her about her commitment and how she has left behind everything to come to this place. There's a strong resonance between that scene and Abraham and Sarah leaving everything in Mesopotamia and going to that land called Palestine that God would show them they hadn't seen yet. Ruth is in a similar situation. She's never seen Bethlehem, and yet she goes. So, Boaz is implying also that Ruth is blessed, just as Abraham and Sarah were blessed. Which also goes with the fact that Ruth says, "Your God shall be my God." She accepts the God of Israel, is blessed for that. Now, something really interesting happens when Ruth then is married to Boaz, etc. She becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to a baby called Obed. And Obed becomes, if I'm not mistaken, grandfather of King David.
Yeah.
None less. Who was also from Bethlehem. So you see the connection now. This is happening in Bethlehem. So it's quite interesting if you look at the words in this text. Because you had then Ruth giving birth, okay, and women in the neighborhood, they have been in on everything here. You know, they don't miss a single detail. And are enthusiastic participants in proceedings. So Ruth is giving birth, and so all these women, they appear, you know, they're having a party to celebrate the birth of this baby, right? And so they do something unusual. Ruth is there, right, with her baby, and the neighboring women come, pick up the baby, carry him, and places him where? On Naomi's lap. Yes. Saying, Naomi has had a baby. How about that? They are celebrating the link between these two women. They have had a baby. And so, there's more to it. They add, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, they use that word, who loves you, has given birth to him. And one thing more, she is more to you than 7 sons. Now, in a male-centered culture, this means something. I think you would agree. 7 sons, wow. And this young woman means more than that. So there's resonances to other parts of the Bible, to the book of Job, who had, I believe, 7 sons and 7 daughters, and to the book of Samuel, by Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. She's barren initially and depressed, and her husband says to her, he loves her, really. He says, am I not more to you than 10 sons? So there's a strong biblical resonance here. So here you have this foreigner, this outsider woman accepted, not because of her marriage to Boaz. That's sort of like an added bonus, if you like, but it's not there. That is not the main reason. She's accepted because of her commitment to another woman into the community in Bethlehem. So, I would that's right. Your daughter-in-law who loves you. Some of you may remember the story of Jacob, who meets Rachel, his cousin, for the first time at the well, where Rachel pulls out water for him and waters his cows, and he falls in love. And it's very clear from the story that Jacob is in love with Rachel, and this is mentioned too. That Tamar was mentioned, and Jacob and Rachel were married. So this whole story is full of biblical resonances. Now, you could then ask, then how does that apply to our context today? Well, from my perspective, it applies a lot more to our context than any of the previous texts we've been discussing. Because, first of all, what's important here for me is this relationship. This is what matters. Relationship and commitment. There is some speculation in some quarters, and I will let them do whatever they feel like doing. That is not my concern. Some people, well, did these 2 women have a sexual relationship? Are they lesbians? All I can say to that is, I don't know. But if it's of no concern to the narrator, why should it be a concern for me? I'm looking at what is a concern, what the narrator is actually saying. And what we're seeing here is a strong bond between 2 people. For me, that is inspiring. So, a few commentators have looked at it from this perspective, saying, okay, well, can we compare that situation of these 2 women and the men they married, etc., with what's going on today? And some people seem to feel, well, why not? You have lesbian couples out there, you have gay couples out there, etc., who produce babies in one way or another and raise children. So we could choose to, if we feel that is helpful for us, to see this story as an ancient precedent of creative ways of building a family.
Surrogacy.
Right? Surrogacy is one of them, isn't it?
Boaz was a surrogate.
You could well say so. You could well say so.
So Obed becomes the social security for these 2
Yes, exactly. Because that is the great bonus they get from that. They have Boaz for now, but then when they get older and frail and Boaz is no more, they have Obed, who will look after his mother and grandmother. So it's a very wise move on their part, most of all. And at the same time, they're still together somehow, and this is being recognized. So the narrator is making a very important point here about relationships, that is what really matters.
It seems to suggest that the relationships between Naomi and
larger context of the family of Boaz, that really the primary relationship is between the two women.
Yes. But that's a very interesting point. The women are in the foreground throughout the story, and the men are there behind them somehow, filling in gaps. But the real story is between the two women.
That's their relationship. And in all likelihood, Boaz probably had one or two wives already.
If he was a wealthy landowner,
Yeah,
he would be
you bet on it.
Absolutely. In fact, one would be really surprised if he hadn't.
Right.
Because there would definitely be some other family in the area who would like to marry off their daughter to him,
Now,
etc. So,
with like the husband of Hannah, she was one of two wives.
yes, she was. So polygamy was certainly,
It was normal.
particularly for the wealthy.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So this will be sort of my concluding remark to that part of the story, but maybe there are other things that we can discuss, because I find it's a fascinating story, and sometimes people say to me, I don't like the Old Testament, as they call it, because it's full of wars and brutality and slaughter and blood and everything else. I said, well, what have you been reading in recent years? Have you read the book of Ruth and is it the book of what? So why not start there, where there's something interesting and strong and fascinating to read? Yes, Doris.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think this has a big statement for us today, because I see a shift even in heterosexual marriage away from procreation and more toward the commitment of the relationship. And this validates that, whereas the marriage was an economic thing.
Yes.
It really wasn't, which most marriages were at that time, it was economic.
They were.
And if love came in, well, that was okay, but it was mostly economic. So
Yes.
I think it validates the idea of a relationship and in a way downplays the idea of procreation.
Yes, it does in fact. But we hear of no other children born to Ruth than Obed, who then becomes a part of the family tree.
Of Jesus, yeah.
Pardon?
Matthew makes references in the genealogy.
Yeah, he does. But it's not like she produced 7 children for this man. That was not even her. And another interesting point is it wasn't Ruth's idea to get married. It's like you were saying, it was an arrangement for convenience reasons.
Yeah.
It was Naomi's idea because this is the only way we two can survive decently in this place. And so they act accordingly. And the interesting thing also is seeing how it's blessed. The whole arrangement is blessed. It's recognized by everybody and they all celebrate it. Because they can see the commitment, but there's no particular interest in it other than that.
So it's almost as if Boaz is the donor.
You can call him, sperm donor.
But he's a little more than that. He is a generous protector
He is.
of these women.
He is. From the beginning.
From the very beginning. So he is more than
That
that.
is true. That is true.
But as you say, the primary story, the foreground story is Ruth and Naomi.
Yeah, it is. Jim?
I have this question because you have a quote in here that Mona West has studied the book of Ruth. This is on the next to the last page. From the point of view of survival and the meaning of the word family. And I agree. I mean, that's a beautiful question which we are facing in our society and in the church today, the notion of the word family. But it also reflects on the notion of the word marriage.
Yes.
So what do we mean by marriage? You know, in a time in which we are looking at the controversy, not in this country, for instance, but in Africa, you know, where there is practice of polygamy, and where we have serial marriages in this country. We don't have polygamous, well, most of us don't have polygamous marriages, but we have, you know, polyamorous arrangements now.
Yeah.
And
Now, so I was going to say, some people are de facto polygamists, although not official.
Right, yes, exactly, that's what I was gonna say, that we have various arrangements, and so, you know, then I think that puts us in an uncomfortable position, which doesn't bother me to be uncomfortable, because Jesus made lots of people uncomfortable. But an uncomfortable position to ask ourselves about the meaning of not just family, but of marriage, and what that means.
Yes.
And-
Now, this is a very important point, but we hear it often, don't we? When these issues come up, people will say, well, what about marriage? Why do these people have to marry? Like 2 women and 2 gay men. I mean, isn't it enough that it's legal, to be gay? And really all kinds of arguments around that. And then they will probably refer you back to Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and attach himself to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So there. All right. Well, I find it an interesting reference actually, and an interesting text. This Genesis 2:24, because when you really begin to look at it, and I feel it's important. In connection with Ruth and Naomi, the resonance is quite clear in the word, right?
Yeah.
But also, when you look at marriage in itself. In Genesis, the way it's described there, people don't really realize what they're quoting.
Right.
They don't really think about it. What they're actually quoting is teenage marriage. This was the norm at the time this text was written. Men would typically marry when they're 14 or 15, and girls when they're around 15. That was a typical age for marriage. So that's why it makes sense for a man to live with his father and mother until he marries. If you see what I mean. Because then they would have a little place of their own, hopefully, he and his young wife. So what people actually, if they really want, to quote that text, what they're saying, we want to bring back teenage marriage because the Bible says so.
Yeah, let's follow the biblical line.
It's very biblical, isn't it?
Yeah, hell yeah.
So, yes.
Well, typical death was probably in the 30s too, after
They died
having
young, yeah.
15 children.
Absolutely.
You had to start young.
And disease could do away with a lot of people in those days. So, yes, exactly. They married early and died a little younger than we do today.
And they had to pop out a lot of kids to ensure that some of them would survive.
Absolutely.
Because the mortality was astonishing.
And part
That's right. And if you live to be old, then some of them will look after you in your old age.
Right.
Yes.
So it's interesting that they put all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
well, also it's part of, because of warfare and all that,
Yes.
a high mortality rate among men. It could be very well be a surplus of women. So polygamy was more of a social concern, I think. So that there can be more children for the community, to survive the tribal group. I was wondering, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I think another example of this kind of, where this kind of language is used, is the relationship between David and Jonathan.
Yes.
And there's no doubt about David's sexual masculine prowess. He had lots of women, but the relationship between him and Jonathan is described as true love, where the relationships with the women are not described in that way. You're familiar with those passages.
Absolutely.
They love each other like a man would love a woman.
Well,
That is the language that's used.
yes, you're very close there. Well, I agree with you. I actually, in the final chapter of this book, after discussing all these texts that are irrelevant, I finally thought, okay, well, I have to add a little something that is relevant. And this is where my new book, forthcoming book, is headed. Is focusing on the relevant passages and reducing the other ones to irrelevant. Using the relevant ones first, putting them first. So that will be a major shift, and it will be quite a bit slimmer, the next volume, okay? For this is good news for you. But don't use it as an excuse for staying away from this one.
Will it be love-bound?
Yes, very much.
Renato, when do you think the new book will be available?
I don't know, but
It's coming out in Danish.
in a year's time.
Huh?
In a year's time.
Okay.
That is my hope and prayer. So, yes, to pick up your point on David and Jonathan. So in the final chapter, I then discuss the book of Ruth from a translator's perspective. I look at the story of David and Jonathan, and I look at the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. And David and Jonathan is also interesting. Or rather, these three stories, they have one word in common, it's love. It's in the book of Ruth, between the two women. It's between Jonathan and David, and it's between the beloved disciple and the master. So those are three important stories when we're going to discuss relationships. There's a fourth story that didn't make it into here, but it will be in my forthcoming book. That's the story of the Roman centurion, the officer, and his beloved slave boy. Which is also a very interesting story, which tells us something about the society in which they lived and about the commitment of this officer towards his beloved male slave. And Jesus recognizes that by healing him. So there are some important, I would say these are the four passages from a new book where I go first. If we want to discuss relationships, let's look at those relationships that are there and where love is part of the picture. That would be when we sort of swept the slate or wiped the slate clean. We can say, okay, well that's where we ought to be starting. We just are 1,500 years late or so, but better late than never, right? So yes, thank you for that. And you're right that David. I would also say that the relationship of David and Jonathan is characterized by the presence of God, or God is called to be their witness. They form a covenant and renew it, and each time they invoke the name of the God of Israel for their bond. And finally, when Jonathan dies on the battlefield, David is exclaiming the famous phrase that, Jonathan, my brother, I'm grieving for you. Your love to me was sweeter than the love of women. And as you're rightly pointing out, David kind of knew what he was talking about. At this time he had a hair on.
But also women were property, and so there's no way the love would be equal.
It wouldn't be the same. You're quite right. But it's interesting, though, and I'm bringing this out a little bit in the story, that there are three persons in the family of Jonathan that love David. The first one to love him is King Saul. The word love is used. Secondly, Saul's daughter Michal. Some people call her Michael, but for me that sounds different. I call her Michal, in Hebrew pronunciation. She loves David. She's madly in love, and she's allowed to marry him. But it doesn't say that David loved her madly. He just accepts. Oh, she's the king's daughter. Oh, sure.
So stupid.
But she certainly does love him. And then finally, we only hear about David's feelings after Jonathan's death, and then he expresses this very moving elegy.
Because there's four different words for love in Greek, did you examine which
Yes.
love was used in all of those?
Yeah, thank you. Well, in the Hebrew, it's basically one word is used for loving relationship, loving feelings. But you're right, in Greek, when you move to the Second Testament, you have to juggle several different terms. Now, the interesting thing about the Newer, or the Second Testament, is that eros is not there. Erotic love is not present in the Newer Testament. You find it a lot in Greek literature. There's plenty of erotic stuff going on in ancient Greece, but you don't find it in the Second Testament. So that word is not part of the equation. But the two main words, and you see that particularly in the story of Jesus and the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. Now, by the way, can anyone here tell me who the name of the beloved disciple? Pardon? Right, but yes.
We're guessing it's John.
Pardon?
We're guessing it's John.
John. Good as any, isn't it? Church tradition teaches that his name is John. But when you go in and read the actual gospel, you'll be hard pressed to find that name mentioned in connection with the beloved disciple. I mean, it's a beautifully written gospel and it's full of literary allusions and I would say subtleties. So they don't serve the name on silver platter. right? You have sort of to feel the way to it. But one British writer called John Henson, I once heard a lecture of his, and he said, well, it's there. It's in John 11. He's got a name. And so, but he wouldn't say it. Oh, so we all rushed home, looked at it. I certainly did. And then I found, his name is Lazarus of Bethany.
Yeah.
Jesus loved Lazarus.
He did. See how he loved him. People said when Jesus weeps before his grave. And the sisters also said to Jesus, the one you love is severely ill. So,
Makes you wonder.
yes, and Jesus then deliberately, outstays that
He
time
waits
and comes
4
when
days.
Pardon?
He waits 4 days before he goes.
Before, exactly, and then he performs that amazing miracle while Lazarus is resurrected from the dead. And the interesting thing is Lazarus is mentioned over, is it 2 or 3 chapters, I forget this minute, but for a short period of time, then the name of Lazarus goes out, but the beloved disciple remains. So it's interesting I kind of make a connection between it. Okay, he's called Lazarus, now we know who that is, we call him the beloved disciple from now on. So I speculate here, just as much as church tradition does, but why not? Because he is mentioned as somebody who Jesus loved. Yes.
I think the case for it being John is the fact that Jesus turned over his mother to John's care,
I'm sorry.
not to Lazarus.
Pardon?
At the cross.
Yes.
But he's not mentioned by name.
No.
No.
He turns over. He turns over the disciple to his mother, and vice versa, to the one Jesus loved. That's what it says.
Yeah.
There's no name attached
That's
there.
interesting.
It's
It
anonymous.
is named.
Well, because we're so used to thinking.
Yeah, tradition.
But it's another example of how we are so used to tradition that we don't even see the text any longer.
Yeah.
But it is the one Jesus loved standing next to his mother, and he asked those two to adopt each other. I mean, for me, it's an amazing scene. You have the master up here, crucified and tortured and agonizing, reaching out to the two people he loved. Right there, from that position. It's an amazing scene when I think of it.
Something else that happens right before Lazarus' name drops off the page is it said that the Pharisees, the chief priests and the scribes and Pharisees want to
To
kill
kill
him.
him.
Because he's the reason everyone's getting so excited.
That's right. Because a lot of converts come to the movement now following the resurrection of Lazarus. So that's right, he's in danger.
Maybe he goes into the witness protection program.
Something.
That's good.
I want to shift a little bit to another irrelevant text in the Second Testament. And that is, when we're talking about sex and sexuality, because that's what all this controversy is about. In the 4th chapter of John's Gospel, when Jesus meets the woman at the well,
Yes.
and nobody ever comments on this, that at the well, Jesus is talking to her. If you knew who you were talking to, into the water, and I'll give you living water, etc. And so then he tells her that, that you have had 5 husbands, and the man you're now with is not your husband. All right? But obviously this is a very strong experience. I mean, she has a husband, a sexual relationship with a husband, with a man who's not her husband. But what is missing from there is Jesus correcting her about this relationship.
Yes.
And so that says volumes. It doesn't comment on the relationship. It doesn't say go away from your husband. It doesn't do any of that.
Right.
Or that you've been wrong about this.
Right.
And he's startled that he knew this about her, but there's no commentary after that. That says volumes to, I think, and the church has missed that one. It doesn't say anything about her sexual life.
Right. It doesn't.
No.
She would fall through many of the parameters applied in some churches today.
Oh, yeah.
She goes back.
She wouldn't be allowed to have communion.
No.
Jesus offers living water.
And she virtually becomes the first missionary.
That's right.
Right. She goes and says,
Yes, it tells everyone else.
Here, the this man that's told me everything I ever did.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of churches out there that wouldn't let Jesus take communion. So.
That's right. So we have, what my point about this part of our Bible study is that we do have 4 important texts when it comes to describing long life bonding between 2 persons of the same sex. Be that of the nature it was, I don't know much about them, but I do know that they are there, these stories, and that they were important to the gospel writers and to the narrators in the First Testament. The very fact that they are there shows there's something important happening. Because that's a lot of what goes into the Bible is because it's unusual. In fact, it is not what some people say, oh, the Bible, is all clear, it all says this and that and the other. Sorry, the Bible doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
The Bible is full of outsiders who are drawn into the center of the action, and sometimes they become the heroes and the heroines. Full of it throughout, I would say, even almost from day one. Did you know the very first human being created what kind of being that he is? The very first one created. Most people don't.
An angel?
Oh, that's a nice suggestion.
Totally wrong.
The question is the first being?
The very first human being created, what is it like? The very first human being created in Genesis.
Adam.
Adam, yes, and what does that mean in that context?
From
From the earth, an earthling. Somebody taken from the earth, Adam. Somebody taken from Adama is an Adam. You see the connection between these words?
Yeah. So a good translation would call him the earthling.
Right. And guess what she calls him? The groundling.
Oh,
Groundling.
So she's spot on there. So that is and a lot of people don't realize that because their translations don't tell them. Which is a great shame. But the Hebrew is reminding us of our connection to the earth on which we walk, and the ground we stand on.
I appreciate very much you pointing this out that the real interest of the biblical writers in these cases
Yes.
is the relationship. And sex is rather peripheral. And I think that's helpful to say that because what I have seen over the years is how people will reduce same-gender couples to the sex act. And they completely are blind to the quality of the relationship that exists between 2 persons who have made a life commitment and love each other and are devoted. And so we can't reduce people and objectify them to a sex act. And when you think of all the time that goes into a companionship of 2 close people, sex is really a very small percentage of that time. I mean, there's a whole life being shared here. And it just seems so unjust to diminish the dignity of a loving couple and objectify them and reduce them to what they do with their genitalia 1% of the time.
Yes.
You know?
I agree.
Yeah.
So it's a great injustice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so pointing this out in the biblical record, the Bible is really more interested in the quality of relationships that exist between persons, and that would include God who is personal.
Yes.
That's the real interest.
Yes.
And we miss that altogether. So
I would say amen to that. Yes.
yeah.
And sometimes the secular culture is more inspired by the Holy Spirit than the church. Because it just reminds me of my mother's favorite program, God rest her soul now, but she used to love the Golden Girls. I used to watch and sit there with her and watch it. But it made me think about what is the meaning of family.
Yes. Well, this is a very good question because I was raised in a family that was, on the surface of things, I would say almost more than normal. Because, I mean, you know, my father, 9 years older than my mother, and they raised 11 children, and very religious, very Christian, very Lutheran, very puritanical, very, very, very everything. And yet, you know, I often wondered why so many things have gone wrong in our family history. Because there were other things, mechanisms there that didn't work. And so today there's very little communication between me and some of my siblings, and with some of them they're not even on speaking terms. So I'm simply, not because I feel my family history is particularly interesting, but simply to give you an example of, yes, on the surface of things, everything may look that it goes according to the book, but scratch a little bit and you'll find lots of other things happening under the surface.
Yeah.
So, the other thing I'm really curious about, you know, after all, I am a translation nerd, I confess that. When the human being, the Adam, is feeling lonely, right? All the animals are introduced, and I say it still because it is an it, and people don't realize. I think it's a he, but it's an it. And the first Adam is an it. Gives names to all these animals, right? And they all appear in couples, and they are all 1 and 2 and 1 and 2, and here am I all by myself, you know, feeling lonely, poor thing, right? Despite being created in the image of God, which must be sort of the superior league of all of this, right? Feeling lonely. So what does the Creator do? Putting it to sleep, and what happens next?
There are 2 its.
Right?
2 its.
2
its.
There's no it's.
Mitosis.
What
They're called woman and man.
right, but what body part is being removed? We all know that, right?
Yeah.
But take it with the Hebrew. Side, S-I-D-E is the Hebrew word. It should be translated for that. But for somebody who decided, no, we'll put rib, you know, and because that puts woman in her place. She was just, you know, you say from man's rib, right? That's woman. She's the helper, right? That places her in an inferior position where she remained for 2,000 years.
Actually.
And may I just finish this point, then I'll come back to you. And we are only now coming out of that. For 100 years or so, women have had the vote in Western countries. They didn't have that until then, did they? Because they weren't considered to be wise and intelligent and mature and blah, 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 all of that. You know, that goes back to ancient philosophers who thought that women, they were inferior. They weren't quite as developed as males. You can read that in Aristotle and many other ancient, and many of the church fathers and medieval theologians. Thank you very much. They were no better. So, but they fed on that story of the rib, because the rib is just a tiny bit, right, of your anatomy. But it's not the Hebrew, it's a side, it's an entire side that is taken off, that it. So that from then on, the it becomes male and female. Separate. Before that, it had both aspects.
It was androgynous.
Yeah. Yes, but it goes well in the Hebrew. Absolutely.
The other thing is, actually, physically, developmentally, in embryo, we all have both traits. And it is only with differentiation with hormonal.
Is that in the 4th or 5th week of gestation?
It takes like 3 months before
You
you
know, it's a chemical reaction because
Right.
the mother's brain releases a chemistry in around the 4th or 5th week that determines which direction the genitalia
will
will
I
go.
see. Right.
And,
But you can't see it very
right,
well.
but it happens that early in
Mm.
those cycles.
That's right. But still, at the very early phases,
Yeah, but
we have an embryo which is both
Both,
or neutral or in the middle or intersex or whatever you want to call it. So what I'm saying is that is reflected in the Hebrew story.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Jewish theologians have been far more open to that interpretation than Christians have. But for Christian theologians, it's important to put woman in her place.
Well,
Sorry, I think you were first.
And I'll apologize for interrupting. I was speaking at a wedding. I was speaking one time with a Presbyterian pastor who was from India. And she said in her tradition, speaking of this particular story, she said the woman was not taken from Adam's head so she could lord it over him.
Yeah.
She was not taken from his feet that she should be under them.
Yeah.
But from his side they should be partners.
Right. There's an old story there she's quoting.
Mm.
It was to roughly the first century. There is a story there, and I'm quoting it in my book. I can't remember the name of the person who wrote that first. It's true, and people love it, and this does sound good. What I'm saying is, it does not match really well with the original text, right? Because it wasn't really original.
We're talking one hour
Yeah.
tape, so we'll sign off here and continue the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Corresponding, that's
Yes.
a corresponding help.
Yes.
You know, meat, it is meat and good, is the old
Yes.
translation of the Anglican, of the Anglican rite, for instance.
That's interesting. I'm reminded now of Robert Alter. You mentioned him
Yeah.
earlier. He has an interesting take on this particular word. He calls it a sustainer beside him.
Right.
I'm going to place a sustainer beside him. Sustainer.
Sustain.
Somebody who has substance, who can sustain somebody.
Right.
So that means somebody of importance.
Yes.
Right.
So that's actually what is there. So what I'm saying is, because some people, they tend to, old story, old tech, people didn't know what they were talking about. In fact, that story is much more sophisticated than many of the interpreters who came later.
Going back to your information about Adam not donating a rib that Eve was taken from his side, actually physiologically that well bears out. First of all, we all have an equal number of ribs. Something horrible happened.
That's right.
And we all started as a cell that became a cell cluster. So it seems to me that in the Jewish explanation of this, the correct translation, basically when Adam slept, he did a cellular division. And split right down the middle and regenerated.
I like that.
That's backed up by how we developed as mammals.
Yes.
Do you have that cover page?
And one could even add another aspect to this. You probably all heard about, in some context or other, about intersex conditions.
Yeah.
Those people who were born sort of in an in-between position, between male and female, or maybe they have both. They are there too. And now I've often felt, well, where do they go for inspiration in the Bible? And it wasn't until I really started engaging with Genesis that, there's something here. The first human being is kind of intersex or hermaphrodite or bigender or whatever you want to call it. There's something there curious about this. And the ancients intuitively sensed this.
Exactly.
And we have now confirmation from science that is actually the original stage of every human being is that one, which I really find
So they
helpful.
intuitively knew that.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that is.
We have a member of the ECC that in San Diego who's an intersex person, or was. Now she's not.
Yeah.
Yes.
David, a couple of you were talking about different words for love, and you said that in Hebrew there's just the one. How did the Septuagint treat that? Was it
Right. I'm probably not. I think my memory is full of holes there. I can't remember offhand.
That would be interesting to compare the text.
It would. I don't remember seeing any gross examples of mistranslation there, but I haven't double-checked every single. Returning to your point earlier, because I was saying eros is not there, and that is not a sufficient answer for then discussing the other ones. But the interesting thing about the beloved disciple, in that story you have both terms that are prevalent in the New Testament for love. One is agape, which is committed love, and the other one is philia, which is affectionate, friendship love. They are both mentioned in connection with the beloved disciple. So that, for me, tells me there was an affection between the master and his disciple, and he was part of the committed circle that surrounded him. He was there all the time, which also goes to show, well, it's no surprise then to see him appearing at the foot of the cross when all the others have fled.
Yeah.
I was just talking to Jim at lunch that in some parts of the world, male affection link arms, and men don't do that.
Right.
But in many parts of the world, men do.
Yes.
And just how here that has confused people. The split, what's appropriate expressions between same-sex or opposite-sex people,
That is very true.
cultural.
I mean, this is slightly an aside, but sort of taking up your point. I have spent 6 years in Spain. I am from Scandinavia, a typical Scandinavian country like Denmark, and I'm always struck whenever I'm living in one of the two countries, coming back from one, going to the other, these cultural differences you're talking about when it comes to interacting affectionately with people. And with most of my Spanish friends of both gender, I give them hugs and kiss them on the cheek. But the difficult part, if I'm then spending a year or two there, which I've done, then going back to Denmark, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, no, they don't do that here, do they? And I start to and you know, you don't but you get yourself into awkward if you take that step too far and you're shooting. Oh, that's true, I'm back in Denmark now. So, but it goes to show a little bit what you're saying, because each culture has definite, certain defined set of norms when it comes to physical interaction, I would say, showing affection, or not showing.
I had a question about Genesis. When it says male and female, it's translated in English, he created them, but does it use the word them?
Yes, but you know, this is an amazing text, and I think you'll have a lot of fun reading chapter 1 in my book about that. Because the text is more sophisticated than that. The Hebrew said, just take for a start, the word for God in Genesis 1 is Elohim. Now, Elohim is a plural word. If you look at it neutrally, take away all the divine varnish that has been put over it, strictly speaking, grammatically, we have a plural word. Gods. Okay? And gods said. But then something really interesting happened between gods and said, because said is singular.
The verb is in the singular.
The verb is held in the singular throughout, and yet, you know, they have this funny plural sounding name, right? But Jewish interpreters have, for my money, a rather helpful interpretation of this. They say, we will never, as human beings, be able to entirely grasp the nature of the divine. So, what this text is doing is presenting different aspects of the divine, leaving us with a mystery.
Yes.
And I can live with that.
Yeah.
But I think that...
So when the first human being, the divinity says, let us create a human being in our image, etc. And then, singular, this divine being goes on to create a human being, male and female he created it, male and female he created them. It's said alternately between plural and singular, which for me means, this is my interpretation coming in now, that the first human being is created as a reflection of this plurality in the divine being, and is therefore male and female, because both male and female reflect an aspect of the divine. So the way the narrator is trying to express this mystery is by alternating between calling it them and calling it it, because it has two aspects to it. That's the they, and it still is one. And it's not until later, when the side is removed, that we have two separate beings. That's how I see the story. And I've found a lot of help with Jewish theologians there.
But that also speaks to the fact that if it went from them to it means that the them needs to be in relationship to become a one in the relationship of a it. That's what speaks to
That could well be part of it, yes.
So the one
It
becomes
opens
two,
up a lot of
who
possibilities.
come back together to become one.
Right. I mean, it opens up a lot of possibilities, you know. So what I'm saying is the language is very sophisticated here and has been made simple. And the stories are given, because I sometimes hear in Christian circles, oh well, let us make, that's the Holy Trinity speaking. Oh, okay. Well, why not? But I mean, it doesn't do much for me. Because you're then also importing a Christian concept into a story that goes back to time before Christianity. So is that fair to Jews? Because you're leaving the Jews out of the discussion there. So I like the textual plurality and mystery far more. Find it more appealing. But we will never be able to put God in a box, singular or plural or in between. We will never.
But although I don't want to be anachronistic and I don't want to read the Trinity of the First Testament, I have to say that Christians have missed what you just said about putting God in the box.
Yes.
Because they forget that 3 in 1, 3 in 1, 3 in 1, 3 in 1. How do you do that mystery? You know,
Still is a mystery.
It still is.
as if we name it Trinity and we understand it.
Yes, that is true. I mean, words have a way of instructing us,
Yeah.
don't they? So, I mean, I have nothing against the Holy Trinity, don't get me wrong. It's just, let us be fair to each text we're reading and place
Let
it
each
in
text speak
context.
for itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's basically what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say.
The beauty of like the Jewish tradition of not speaking the name of God.
Yes.
And for us to, the problem with this morality stuff is that we think we have it all figured out.
Yes.
And if we don't approach it as a mystery, it always made me really think a lot about it. Like Jesus was always doing stuff that was contrary to the code.
He was criticized over and over.
Again and again, whether it was about the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath, eating wheat and plucking it and eating it on the Sabbath, or whatever he was doing, and we ignored that. We just flew in the face of the code, of the tradition.
In fact, the Bible itself, if we want to take it seriously, is full of such stories that you're pointing out. So when some people want to use it as a code of righteousness and right behavior and so on and so forth, well, I'm afraid they're being at least as selective as anybody else. They're just focusing on a few passages. Sorry.
There's in your packet something I found on the internet that just stunned me. It's a liturgy to Leviticus. Read that when you get a chance. It's on the right side.
And even the much vilified Leviticus has its own redeeming features.
Absolutely.
I figured out. And so I'm reminded of a Jewish rabbi, I think he lives in Wisconsin, or thereabouts, or used to. He has written a book about his own growing up with Scripture, and he's gay. So he didn't have an easy time when he was listening to Leviticus, because it's precisely that text of Leviticus 18 that is being recited on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur. And he had to listen to that every year, precisely on that day. It was no fun. But the way he describes, the way he walked with that story, he never chickened out. He would be there every year, and he describes as he's growing older, and he can feel the impact of these words coming to him, tears rolling down his cheek, and feeling the pain and the unfairness, he said, of the heavenly accusations against me. But the way he describes his journey for me has been very moving, because one day he feels old enough that he knows it's coming, and yet his heart starts pounding, and you could feel the sweat and so on. One day he just decides to stand in silence as that is being read. So he can't take it sitting down anymore, but he almost so spontaneously rises from his seat, just stands there with tears in his eyes. And a year or two later, he said, maybe it's my turn now. So he volunteers to do the reading for that day in the synagogue. Can you believe it? And the way he describes it is amazing. I'm quoting part of his story in that book, but the way he describes it is better than mine. But he then, when the moment comes and somebody signals to him, now it's your, he then walks up the aisle and he can feel his heart go, you know, this is hard stuff. And he climbs the stairs and then he stands there in front and the scroll is open. It's almost take my breath away to tell the story. And he says, the scroll is open, it feels like I'm bearing my heart to this congregation. And he's reading these words, and he said, for the first time in my life, I feel this is strangely poetic. He can suddenly feel the cadences of the words, with a male you shall not lie, with a woman you shall not lie down, blah, 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 and all of that. And it was like, he felt for the first time he was looking Leviticus in the eye, face to face. You were just being dumped on him, but now suddenly they were almost becoming equals. So the way he describes that story is amazing. And I'm mentioning this because that, in a way, sums up my own journey with all these texts in the Bible. That if I didn't know when I started that it was going to take me 10 years. I might have had second thoughts. But that has been my experience in one way or another with each one of these texts. You know, I think I mentioned to you earlier today the word demons, facing your demons. I felt drawn into them. It wasn't like, yeah, I'm a great hero, I can face these demons, you know, until where even. It wasn't that, but I felt kind of sort of drawn or nudged to go in there. And I had a similar experience with each one of them. It's like, okay, oh, this is what there is. Oh, I hadn't thought of that part. So that for me has been a very important discovery, and yes, my faith has not only been confirmed but deeply through the experience.
Because you engaged.
Yes, exactly. There was a dialogue.
Yeah, and it's dialogical.
Yes, yes. Very true.
And I think that the nature of the scriptures written, it's like an invitation to
Yes. I feel that, in fact, I find it's the most helpful way for me to go into the text and ask it questions.
Yeah.
And did you know that some of the ancient rabbis, they agreed that, on this bit of wisdom, saying, God loves our questions. Because then there can be dialogue. Right? The Bible is not a sledgehammer that we should bang on. No, ask questions of it and see what replies or answers you get. So I'm very much indebted to the Jewish tradition here from that perspective. I'm a Christian, and I love
We
you.
lost so much of
Yeah.
Jewish tradition.
When we threw
We
Judaism
lost-
out, yes,
Oh, we
we were losers.
We were the losers.
Yeah, we impoverished our own.
We did.
Who was the writer of the
Sorry,
Who was the book?
Stephen Greenberg.
Oh, it's on my reading. I put it on the reading.
Wrestling with God and with men.
Yeah.
Particularly that bit on Leviticus is just so extraordinary. So, and another thing that I'm reminded of over and over, and I hope I will never forget it, because we live in a culture that is always looking for certain answers. You know, we want the fixed answer to this, and we're preset forevermore. The Bible isn't like that, and the ancient rabbis realized this. I love, the way some of them describe the way they conducted Bible study. You know,
Gosh, we lost it.
oh, they would sit around a table, let's say one of these tables, there would be a group, right? One would read the text, and then they put the book down, and then every person in the room in turn would speak the thoughts that had come into their mind as they were listening to the text. There was no judge saying, oh, sorry, that's not good enough. Your opinion is enough. No, everybody would be heard out. And they concluded from those exercises they held, there are 70 interpretations to the Torah. It's brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant. You cannot put a closing date on interpretation on the Bible. There's always something there to be discovered.
That's how it stays living.
Pardon?
That's how it stays living.
Yeah.
Exactly.
A word for each generation.
There's something for each generation to discover, and they already discovered it then. So unfortunately for centuries, Christians say, well, this is all you need to know, which is really diminishing Scripture.
History trumps ideology.
Right. Yeah.
And one of my favorite stories, which some of the people here have heard, was I was listening to Charlie Rose, as he was interviewing Bernard Henri Lévy.
Sorry, what was that?
You know Bernard Henri Lévy, the French,
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so Lévy had come to the United States and made a journey and wrote about it. And part of what he did was he went to Las Vegas and he went to California and all these things. But part of it was he went to a mega church.
Oh,
Yeah. And so he writes he really didn't have a positive experience in this church. And so Charlie asks him, well, why is this? Thinking maybe it was because Levy's not Christian or something like that. He said, no. He said, in our Judeo-Christian tradition, especially prophetic tradition, we have the light and the darkness, the doubt and the faith. He said, but in this church I found no doubt.
All right.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's perfect.
Yeah. And
Isn't that nice when God agrees with everything you believe?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that really says, because what you're describing by the Midrashic experience and so forth, and this whole thing of you and the rabbi in the darkness and light, gosh, this is the experience of God.
Before too many people leave this place,
Yeah.
could we have a quick photo session?
Yes, I'll do it. Yes, everybody.
Where do you want?
Well, where shall we do it?
Against the,
We can do it in the sanctuary.
This is good here.
Okay.
Well, if we want to be authentic, we don't have to.
Yeah.
We're going to have a closing of some
Snuggle
kind.
up now.
Are we going to have some kind of a closing?
Come on,
I don't
snuggle
know.
up.
I will ask the.
Everybody turn this way.
That was the most unusual
You see Michael on his face.